December 18, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. The forest lay bruised and silent under a lid of grey snow. A convoy of captured American trucks idled beside a shattered farmhouse. German soldiers, mud-streaked, hollow-eyed from weeks of fighting, circled the vehicles like wolves around prey. One of them, Obergefreiter Klaus Reiner, pried open a canvas crate with his bayonet. Inside, neatly packed in tins and wax paper, was something he hadn't tasted in months: fresh beef, still pink, sealed against rot. His gloved hand trembled as he lifted it to the light. Another soldier laughed bitterly when he found rows of cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee packets marked U.S. Army. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. American rations looked like a feast in the middle of famine. Around them, German troops had been gnawing on frozen bread and thin cabbage stew for weeks. But here, in the middle of the Ardennes, the enemy's supplies were overflowing with luxuries: fresh meat, real coffee, even gum. The men passed the tins in stunned silence, reading the English labels aloud, as though the words themselves were from another world. To the Germans, the sight was both awe and insult. They had been told the Americans were soft, dependent on machines, incapable of surviving hardship. Yet here even their food spoke of overwhelming abundance. The Wehrmacht's rationing system had long since broken under the weight of retreat, fuel shortages, and bombed rail lines. Meanwhile, the Americans could feed an army of millions across an ocean and still deliver cigarettes by the carton. This was not chance. Behind every tin of meat and every cigarette was a vast unseen empire of logistics, a machine that turned the industrial heart of America into sustenance at the front. While the German soldier scoured frostbitten fields for potatoes, American quartermasters and engineers were designing kitchens that could move with the army, refrigerated trucks that could cross continents, and packaging that resisted heat, moisture, and decay. Months earlier, in the summer of 1944, when the Allied advance raced through France, GIs had grown accustomed to mail, fresh fruit, and even ice cream following close behind the tanks. It wasn't morale alone. It was strategy. Feeding men well kept them sharp, disciplined, and loyal. Eisenhower knew it. Patton demanded it. An army travels on its stomach, Napoleon had once said. But the Americans perfected the industrial version of that truth. The German High Command underestimated the power of food. They had measured divisions in tanks and artillery, not calories and comfort. The U.S. Army saw it differently. Its quartermaster corps calculated down to the ounce: 4,000 calories per soldier per day, 12 ounces of meat, 2 cigarettes per meal, plus vitamins, sugar, and salt. In a single week, an infantry division consumed over 200 tons of food. Multiply that by the 100 divisions deployed across Europe, and you begin to understand why German officers at Bastogne stared at those tins in disbelief. Inside a captured American mess truck, one German lieutenant found an electric field stove still humming. The smell of cooked beef lingered in the air. He stared at it as if it were sorcery. To him it was. His own men were heating soup over candles made from melted boot grease. How could an army so far from home eat like this? How could it be possible? The answer lay far from the frozen Ardennes. It began years earlier, in the factories of Chicago, Detroit, and Newark. When war broke out, the U.S. didn't just draft soldiers. It drafted butchers, packers, canners, and chemists. Food scientists invented new methods to keep meals edible for months without refrigeration. Armour and Company, Swift, and Hormel became as vital to victory as any tank plant. These companies retooled entire production lines for the battlefield, sealing meat in vacuum tins and wrapping it in waxed cardboard. Each can carried not just protein, but proof of an industrial giant's reach. Meanwhile, the Germans had rationed their own people to near starvation levels. By 1944, average Wehrmacht rations had fallen below 1,500 calories per day. Bread was bulked with sawdust. Coffee was roasted acorns. Tobacco was scarce and traded like gold. Letters from the front were filled with complaints, not of fear but of hunger. "We fight on empty stomachs," wrote one Lancer in December, "and the Americans smoke as they shoot." The contrast went deeper than food. Cigarettes had become a symbol of morale, a ritual of calm amid chaos. For the Americans, every ration kit came with a few sticks of Lucky Strikes or Chesterfields. They were small comforts that tethered men to the idea of home. When the Red Ball Express trucks thundered toward the front, they carried not just ammunition, but the illusion of normal life. A smoke after battle, a hot meal at dusk. These details mattered more than any general realized. In those final winter months, German propaganda tried to spin the contrast. They mocked the Americans for dependence on luxuries, claiming that true warriors survived on bread and blood alone. But even as the words echoed through radio speakers, morale was crumbling. Soldiers knew the truth. Hunger made cowards of them all. In frozen foxholes, the men who had once laughed at American abundance now envied it bitterly. That night near Bastogne, Reiner and his comrades sat beside a captured crate of American rations. They dared not eat much, it felt like betrayal, but they couldn't resist a taste. The meat was rich and warm, the cigarette smooth and endless. He took a long drag, exhaled into the dark and muttered, "No wonder they keep coming." His sergeant said nothing. Somewhere in the distance, an American artillery battery began to fire, the night sky flashing in rhythm. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the scent of cooked beef. It wasn't lost on them that this was more than luck or luxury, it was power. Every ration tin meant a ship had crossed the Atlantic, a dockworker had loaded it, a rail car had carried it, and a soldier had delivered it through chaos. The Germans had no such machine anymore. Their world was collapsing inward, starving from its own shortages. And so as dawn crept over the Ardennes, the question lingered in every German mind. If the Americans could feed their men like this, what else could they do? The answer would come soon enough, hidden in the roaring engines of supply convoys, in mobile field kitchens that followed the advance like clockwork, in the strange, unstoppable rhythm of an army that never ran out of food, cigarettes, or willpower, because the secret of American victory wasn't just in their tanks or planes. It was in the warmth of their coffee, the bite of their rations, the steady heartbeat of a supply chain that stretched across oceans. And soon, the German soldiers who thought they understood war would realize they were fighting an enemy whose greatest weapon wasn't steel or fire, but abundance. The secret behind those miraculous tins of beef and endless cigarettes began long before the Ardennes. It started in 1940, when the United States was still at peace. In quiet factories along the Midwest, engineers and scientists were already reimagining how to feed an army that didn't yet exist. While Europe starved, America industrialized its appetite. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was a weapon of endurance. At the center of it all was the Quartermaster Corps, an organization that operated like an empire within an army. Their laboratories in Chicago and Natick became temples of innovation. Chemists discovered ways to sterilize meat with steam under pressure, without destroying flavor. Packaging engineers perfected wax-lined cartons that resisted rot and rain. Refrigeration specialists redesigned truck compressors to survive desert heat and Arctic cold. By 1942, the Quartermaster Corps could deliver a meal anywhere on Earth within 48 hours of departure. Private companies joined the war of sustenance. Armour, Swift and Hormel transformed slaughterhouses into engines of logistics. One of their crowning creations was the sea ration, a miracle of efficiency. 12 ounces of meat, compact, balanced in calories and vitamins, resistant to mold, and ready to eat in minutes. Each sea ration was tested for flavor, endurance, and shelf life under simulated battlefield conditions. Soldiers joked that the cans could survive a direct hit, and sometimes they did. But the genius lay not in one meal, but in the system. A single infantry division required 60 tons of food every day. That meant over £2 million per month for each unit alone. The American supply chain could feed 12 million soldiers worldwide without interruption. In North Africa, refrigerated trains carried beef from ports in Casablanca to units in Tunisia. In Italy, field kitchens roasted fresh poultry within artillery range. On Pacific Islands, engineers built floating refrigerators from converted Liberty ships. This scale was unprecedented. The Germans couldn't even dream of it. When the Wehrmacht advanced into Russia in 1941, its supply lines collapsed under the weight of mud and frost. Soldiers froze, starved, and scavenged from local villages. The Americans, by contrast, built a conveyor belt of sustenance. Fuel, ammunition, and food moved on a rhythm so steady that frontline soldiers called it the heartbeat. Every crate, every tin, every cigarette was part of a choreography, that stretched from Kansas City to Normandy. The secret advantage went deeper than logistics. It was psychological. To an American soldier, opening a ration tin wasn't just eating. It was a reminder that home hadn't forgotten him. Every flavor, every puff of smoke carried a whisper from across the ocean. You are not alone. This invisible lifeline gave them the mental strength to endure fear, boredom, and death. The quartermaster generals understood that morale could be packaged, shipped, and consumed. Cigarettes, in particular, became a cultural weapon. Tobacco companies worked hand in hand with the military, printing victory packs stamped with patriotic slogans. Each soldier received up to a pack a day. Cigarettes were currency, therapy, and ceremony. After battle, when silence returned, men lit up in synchronization. The smoke rising over the trenches looked almost like a flag, thin, grey, but proud. German prisoners often begged for cigarettes more than food. They represented calm, victory, and civilization amid chaos, yet even this indulgence was calculated. Psychologists advising the War Department knew that routine comforts reduced combat fatigue. So rations were designed not only for nutrition, but for predictability. A soldier could count on that tin of meat, that square of chocolate, that morning coffee, regardless of where he fought. Predictability in an unpredictable war became a source of control. It gave soldiers the illusion that life still obeyed rules. While American engineers refined abundance, German planners were dismantling it. By 1944, Allied bombers had destroyed most of the Reich's food infrastructure. Rail depots smoldered, fields lay fallow, and factories couldn't produce enough tin to can their dwindling reserves. A German infantryman might receive a single loaf of bread to last 3 days. Meat rations were so rare that horses were slaughtered to feed men. Soldiers joked grimly that their next meal would come from their transport animals. It wasn't far from truth. That disparity erupted during the Battle of the Bulge. As German forces struck deep into the Ardennes, their assault units quickly outran their supply lines. Tanks ran dry of fuel, and men survived on captured American rations. German diaries from the front tell of soldiers opening American sea ration boxes with tears in their eyes. One entry described it simply: "It tastes like victory, though not ours." For American troops, the contrast became a morale weapon. At Bastogne, surrounded and nearly cut off, U.S. paratroopers held out partly because supply drops included not just ammunition, but coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Those small comforts steadied nerves as much as bullets steadied defense. When German envoys demanded surrender, General McAuliffe famously replied, "Nuts." Few knew how literal that was. His men were still eating them. Behind the front, the Red Ball Express kept the miracle alive. Thousands of African-American drivers operated day and night, roaring through bombed-out roads from Normandy to the Rhine. They moved 25,000 tons of supplies every day, food among them. Many drove without headlights, guided only by memory and moonlight. Their work meant the difference between hunger and hope. Engineers maintained the trucks relentlessly, swapping out engines on the roadside, welding through rain and mud. Every pound of beef at the front was paid for by sweat, diesel, and determination. In contrast, German supply officers recorded despair. They wrote of horses dying in harness, of carts abandoned in snow, of men stealing from each other to survive. Discipline eroded as hunger set in. A starving soldier cannot fight. He dreams of food more than victory. And that, more than any weapon, broke the Wehrmacht's will. Even captured Germans noticed the paradox. The Americans, whom propaganda had mocked as soft consumers, were fighting harder than ever. Their bellies were full, their lungs filled with smoke, and their spirits unbroken. It wasn't luxury, it was efficiency turned into resilience. Abundance gave them freedom to focus on the fight. In factories back home, workers understood this. Posters reminded them that every can counts. Women operating sealing machines knew that their work would end up in a soldier's hands. One shift of labor could mean 100 meals at the front. The home front wasn't just feeding the army. It was feeding the idea that industrial strength could replace scarcity forever. By late 1944, the proof was undeniable. American soldiers were healthier, stronger, and more confident. German divisions were thinning not from bullets, but from exhaustion and malnutrition. When the Allied counteroffensive began, it rolled forward on a full stomach. For the first time in modern history, An army's logistics had become a weapon as lethal as its guns. In every mess tent, in every convoy, in every can of meat that steamed under a grey European sky, the world saw what total war meant when fueled by total industry. The Germans had fought for ideology. The Americans fought on calories, caffeine and consistency, and that somehow was stronger. As 1945 approached, the question facing the crumbling Reich was no longer how to win, but how to endure another day. The Americans, however, were just beginning to understand the true power of what they'd built. Their secret wasn't a bomb or a bullet. It was the ability to feed millions and make them believe that comfort and courage could coexist. And that realization, born in tin cans and tobacco smoke, would soon reshape not just the battlefield, but the entire post-war world. Spring 1945. Across the Rhine, the final thunder of the European war was beginning to fade. German cities smoldered in ruin, their citizens standing in endless lines for bread. The Third Reich, once obsessed with conquest and glory, was starving in its own shadow. Meanwhile, American soldiers sat on the steps of captured towns, eating canned peaches, drinking coffee, and lighting cigarettes. The war had revealed a truth deeper than tactics or courage. The side that could feed its army could command the world. For every platoon advancing into Germany, food was more than sustenance. It was proof of continuity, a reminder that the machinery of the Republic still reached them across oceans and continents. The same hands that built tanks in Detroit were sealing cans in Chicago. The same locomotives that carried Sherman armor also hauled beef, bread, and coffee. It was a miracle of organization, a supply chain so vast that it seemed invincible. Soldiers could eat hot stew at the edge of hell and know that somewhere, beyond the gunfire, an entire nation was working for them. The impact of that system went far beyond the battlefield. It changed morale, discipline, and endurance. German soldiers, exhausted and underfed, began surrendering in greater numbers. Hunger broke them before bullets did. Interrogation reports later revealed that many had believed American forces would collapse from distance and indulgence. Instead, they found an army so well fed and organized that it seemed to grow stronger the deeper it pushed into Europe. The myth of the soft American collapsed under the weight of 1,000 supply trucks. Inside those convoys, every box told a story. One crate might hold thousands of ration tins, another carried tobacco, a third powdered milk. Behind each was an engineer who had calculated weights, energy, and preservation times down to the minute. The Quartermaster Corps' success was not accidental. It was designed through science and relentless innovation. Their work had fused chemistry, logistics, and psychology into one weapon. Soldiers no longer depended on local harvests or foraging. They depended on precision. That precision was the reason American morale never fractured. Even in the mud of the Hurtgen forest or the chaos of the Bulge, soldiers trusted that their next meal would arrive. It was an invisible contract between the fighter and the nation. When one link in the chain broke, another replaced it. Pilots risked enemy fire to drop ration crates over surrounded units. Engineers rebuilt bridges overnight to keep supply lines flowing. Mechanics worked until dawn repairing trucks frozen solid. War became a rhythm of work and willpower, a machine fed by human faith. German prisoners could hardly comprehend it. Their own supply officers had warned that the Reich could not sustain its armies past the winter. Coal shortages crippled trains. Bombed bridges turned shipments into death marches. The Wehrmacht, built on speed and aggression, was collapsing under hunger. One captured officer described the experience simply: "We fought men who never seemed to tire, never seemed to want." That was the power of abundance. It erased fatigue and fear alike. Psychologists studying post-war documents would later call it the morale multiplier. Soldiers who were well-fed not only performed better, but believed more strongly in their cause. They saw themselves as invincible because their stomachs were never empty. Even luxury became strategy. The cigarette, so trivial in appearance, became an icon of control. When the smoke curled through the ruins of Cologne or Frankfurt, it signaled order amid chaos. Where Germans saw defeat, Americans saw routine. That same principle shaped the home front. For every GI lighting a lucky strike, there were workers in American towns who had rolled the tobacco, packed the cartons, and labeled them for shipment. Housewives collected bacon grease to make explosives. Factory lines operated 24 hours a day to fill ration crates. Food became patriotism itself. It was democracy rendered edible. Millions of people united by the act of feeding victory. After the war ended, this invisible weapon didn't fade. It evolved. The techniques born in the quartermaster laboratories became the backbone of post-war industry. Instant coffee, freeze-dried meals, powdered milk, all found their way into civilian life. The same companies that had nourished armies began feeding peacetime America. The message was clear. Abundance had won the war and it would define the peace. The Germans too took note. During occupation, they were stunned by the generosity of American rations. In 1945, children in Berlin lined up for care packages, boxes filled with corned beef, biscuits, and chocolate. For many, it was their first real meal in years. The nation that once brought fire and destruction was now feeding its former enemy. It was a paradox of power. To feed is to rule without bullets. Within military strategy, the lesson became doctrine. Future wars would not only be won by tanks or aircraft, but by logistics. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf. Each conflict carried echoes of the quartermaster's triumph. The principle was immortal. No soldier fights well on an empty stomach. Generals planned offensives not just by maps and terrain, but by calories, fuel, and morale. Food was no longer a background concern. It was a frontline weapon. Even in modern conflicts, the American model endures. Field kitchens produce thousands of meals in minutes. Refrigerated containers cross deserts on unmanned convoys. Technology has changed, but the philosophy remains. Feed the will and the fight endures. The spirit that once delivered meat and cigarettes to Bastogne now delivers precision rations to remote bases across the world. Behind every soldier stands a chain of unseen heroes, cooks, drivers, scientists, engineers, whose labor keeps the front alive. Looking back, the Germans' disbelief in 1944 was more than shock. It was revelation. They had built an army on ideology and conquest, but the Americans had built one on infrastructure and care. One fed hunger for power. The other fed human need. When those two met on the frozen roads of the Ardennes, it wasn't just bullets that decided fate, it was breakfast. The story of those tins and cigarettes is the story of industrial humanity mastering war through compassion disguised as efficiency. Feeding millions wasn't kindness, it was strategy. But in doing so, it preserved the humanity of those who fought. Every meal shared in the mud, every cigarette between friends, every coffee sipped before battle reminded them of what they were fighting to protect. A world where hunger would never again decide who lived and who died. As the guns fell silent and Europe rebuilt, the legacy of that unseen weapon lived on. It shaped the modern military, the modern economy, and even the modern mind. The lesson was immortal. Abundance is power. The ability to sustain, to nourish, to comfort under fire. That is the true mark of a civilization prepared for any storm. In the ruins of Germany, a captured soldier once watched Americans unpack crates of food for the starving locals. He whispered to no one, "They conquer with kindness." That line, whether spoken or imagined, carried the truth of an age. Because in the end, victory in World War II wasn't just written in smoke, steel, or blood. It was written in warmth, in flavor, in the scent of coffee rising over a quiet morning after years of thunder. The empire of rations had fed the free world, and in doing so had changed it forever.